Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Map Room. I'm your host, Eric Cunningham, and with us this week, as usual, we have Jared Stone and Nick Morris. And we're going over a state that's actually been a lot in the news lately. If you've looked at some of the presidential polling, this state has been surprisingly competitive. It's the state of Ohio. Ohio has long been one of the country's bellwether states. It's been a little bit more Republican than average, but it's simply gone to the winner of the presidential election. It's had a pretty competitive history overall at the presidential level, and it's seen a lot of interesting elections the last few decades. But to really look at what's going on in Ohio, you have to look underneath the surface to see why Democrats might actually have a better chance in Ohio than previously thought or had been previously expected before going into this cycle. So we'll go ahead and jump into things. I'm going to first off show a couple of maps I've made, which are of the statistical areas and the metropolitan areas of Ohio. And these are kind of important just as a distance to give you an idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about the state of Ohio. Because it's a very large state. It's one of the largest in the country, in fact. And it has a lot of areas that are associated with metropolitan and large cities. So you'll notice right here, this is the state of Ohio's combined statistical area. So this is basically all the metropolitan areas plus micropolitan areas and surrounding areas. And so overall, most of the state, as you notice here, is part of a combined statistical area. So most of the state is somewhat urban or somewhat suburban or exurban even, or micropolitan, as the census likes to call some of these smaller but fairly decently sized communities. So the first thing I wanted to go over here, which is kind of big, is the Cleveland area. So Cleveland, Akron, Canton. If you're familiar with Canton, that's the home of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. A lot of these areas, if you're really familiar with football, you'll remember these names from the early teams of the National Football League because they were all based in Ohio, which had been and is one of the largest centers of football in the country. So this Cleveland area is by far the largest metropolitan area in the state, or combined statistical area, 3.6 million people. And as you'll notice here, it has a small but consistent Democratic advantage, about 4 or so. We don't have 2016 results, but Trump did make substantial inroads in this area, although none of that is for certain. There are Republicans who represent portions of the Cleveland area and of this region in Congress. But historically, it's been a fairly Democratic area. Second is Columbus. So Columbus is in the center of the state. It's the state capital. It has some of the most egregious city lines you'll ever see in any state. I mean, I'll go ahead and highlight these. They're just atrocious lines overall. But Columbus is a Democratic area, but the region as a whole actually matches the state fairly closely. It's Republican +1. Republicans on average tend to lose this area, but narrowly so. We noticed in 2008 that Barack Obama won this by around 2.5%. Which, considering his statewide margin, really isn't that impressive. The next area is the Cincinnati area, which is historically one of the Republican bastions of the state. Cincinnati has long had some Republican mayors that had Republican influence in the city government. Even notable arch conservatives like Ken Blackwell have served as the mayor of Cincinnati. In recent years, the city itself has become more Democratic, but the region as a whole has shifted right. Similarly, areas in Kentucky are also a little bit more suburban, have become a little bit more Democratic, but the growth on the Ohio side has made an area that's pretty decidedly Republican here. You'll notice that in 2008, John McCain won it by 10%, and he did not do very well in Idaho. So that's really telling you how Republican this area is historically. The fourth is the Dayton area. Dayton, again, is a Republican-leaning area, although the city of Dayton itself leans Democratic. It's the only other combined area that has over 1 million people. And then I'm just going to go through a lot of these other quickly. 5 is Toledo. If you're a fan of history, you'll know that Ohio and Michigan once fought a war over Toledo. And arguably, Ohio lost by winning Toledo long term. It is kind of a joke you could make. But overall, this area leans Democratic, but saw a big gain for Trump in the 2016 elections and since. Youngstown is another area. This is an Appalachian area in a coal country, close to Pittsburgh and close to Erie. And it leans Democratic, although not overwhelmingly so. 7 is a smaller metropolitan area based in areas like Lima and Van Wert. It's not really that important. It's a fairly small area, as are most of the rest of these. 8 is, again, another small one. It's based in the center of the state around Ashland, not especially noteworthy. And then finally, you have 9, which is there's not any large cities in this 9th combined statistical area, but this is basically just grouped with Charleston, West Virginia. There are actually other metropolitan areas that are lumped with West Virginia, like around Wheeling and Parkersburg, but I didn't include these because they only include one county in Ohio. And so that's the combined areas. And you notice it's fairly well balanced. Like Ohio as a whole, none of these are overwhelmingly for one party or the other. And in fact, they've all seen trends to some degree. Metropolitan areas themselves look a little bit different. I just wanted to show this because it gives you an idea of the actual, like these are the core urban areas of the state. You notice here, by far, Columbus is the largest in terms of size, but Cleveland is the largest, the fourth in terms of population overall. And these tend to lean decidedly more Democratic. So I showed you before, Cleveland is narrowly Democratic. Here it's heavily Democratic. The same could be said of Columbus. It's fairly Democratic. Cincinnati and Dayton still remain fairly conservative. Toledo is much more Democratic here because it only takes in like the core areas of Toledo. And then finally, places like Akron and places like Canton also lean Democratic to a degree, although Canton has become much more Republican as of late. So those are the basic areas that you go over when you're talking about Ohio. And so now it's kind of time to show a little bit more about Ohio. We'll go into later the statewide races, but I wanted to mention that Ohio at the state level is very Republican. Since the 1990s, there's only been one Democratic governor. Democrats had a great year in 2006, swept almost all the statewide offices. But aside from a handful of races like Lee Fisher's win in the attorney general race in the 90s, they've been completely shut out of state government. You'll notice the legislature has been consistently Republican over this time period, with a handful of exceptions in the House. And some of this is attributable to gerrymandering, but not all of it. Another thing you'll notice is the governors have tended to serve 2 terms. The governors have tended to be Republican, and all statewide officers are Republican. Senators, on the other hand, have been more competitive. Howard Metzenbaum, John Glenn, and more recently Sherrod Brown have had a pretty firm grip on Senate races, even as the state as a whole at the state level leans Republican. It's really at the federal level where the Democratic strength in Ohio tends to come out. And so I'll kind of run through these real quick, just to show you the bulwark bellwether status we're talking about. In 1976, Jimmy Carter narrowly won nationwide, and he narrowly won Ohio. He won it by around 11,000 votes. Losing Ohio wouldn't have lost him the election, but it certainly did benefit him to have this state. It was a fairly large electoral victory instead of a small one. 1980, Ronald Reagan won Ohio, and it almost matched the national vote perfectly. 51% for Reagan, 40% for Carter, 6% for John Anderson, who ran as a liberal independent candidate. 84, similar story. 20-point win nationwide, 20-point win in Ohio. Not a whole lot to say there. 88 actually skewed a little bit more Republican than the rest of the country. Bush only won the race nationwide by around 7 percentage points, but he won in Ohio by around 11. And notice again, really the only residual Democratic strength here is around Cleveland, around Toledo, and in some of these Appalachian communities in the northern corner of the state, the northeastern corner adjacent to Pennsylvania and West Virginia, especially. These West Virginia counties were very Democratic back in the day. 92, this again matched the nationwide vote very closely. Clinton won by around 3 points nationwide, and he won by 2 in Ohio. 96, a little bit more Republican than the nation as a whole. 6-point win here as opposed to nearly a 10-point one nationwide. You'll notice again, Clinton has actually gained a lot of strength. He's gained in these sorts of areas around Toledo, the Great Lakes region, and also in the communities adjacent to Pennsylvania and West Virginia. 2000, George Bush lost the popular vote infamously by 500,000 votes, but he easily won Ohio. He won it by over 150,000 votes. You'll notice here again, Republican strength has tended to be a little bit narrower in this northeastern portion, and he also lost areas like Columbus and like Dayton, but he did so by small margins. 2004, Ohio was the tipping point state. George Bush won by 2 points nationally, 2 to 3 points, and he won by around 2 points in Ohio. Some Democrats to this day will dispute this election. A lot of a popular conspiracy theory has been that the voting machines caused the state to vote for Republicans because the exit polling indicated a Kerry win, while the actual votes indicated a Republican win. But this is mainly just a conspiracy theory. There's not any water to it. Bush won the state by a very large margin, although a narrow margin by the popular vote. Keep in mind, a 2-point margin in Ohio is only around 100,000 votes, which is relatively narrow by most state standards. 2008, Barack Obama was the master of the Midwest in terms of winning over these white working class voters. And you can see this right here. All of this, aside from the little corridor here that stretches from Cincinnati to some of these areas around Columbus, he did really well with these white working class voters. He won over a lot of these counties, kept them to under 60% of the vote, and was able to win the state handily, close to his national margin, but a little bit lower. 2012, Mitt Romney really wanted to win Ohio, and he campaigned hard, but Barack Obama was able to leverage his support for the auto bailouts, among other things, to keep most of his support. You'll notice he lost a little bit of the rural strength overall, and Romney gained a little bit in some rural areas, but overall, there wasn't a whole lot of change here. One thing you will want to note is Hamilton County right here, the home of Cincinnati, has become increasingly Democratic over this period. It voted for Bush 2 times. It voted for him in 2000 and 2004, but it voted Obama in 2008 and has voted for him, for Democrats ever since. Finally, the shock of the election was Donald Trump winning Ohio by an 8-point margin. Now, his total was only 51%, 51.7%, but this really shocked a lot of people. All of this blood red rural areas around even the northeastern steel communities. These areas had been Republican down ballot for a little while, had voted for Republicans in that area, but this was really a shocking moment for Democrats, just realizing how poorly they had fallen. On the other hand, they did make gains. They gained in areas around Columbus. They gained in Hamilton County. They did okay in Cuyahoga County and areas around here, but it was that white working class voter strength that really flipped the state. Going into this cycle, we have at Elections Daily, we have the race at a toss-up, and we don't foresee moving it out of the column until close to Election Day. Polling has indicated actually in recent weeks, Biden gaining a small advantage. The question will be whether that advantage, if it exists and if it lasts to Election Day, comes from winning back that Obama coalition of white working class voters, or in driving up strength in places like Hamilton County, in places like Columbus, and in places like Canton, Cleveland, Akron, and Toledo. So that's kind of the recent national history of Ohio. And as you can see, it's been a fairly competitive state until 2016. So I'm going to go throw it off to Nick, who is going to kind of go into a lot more detail on these regional and demographic trends we're seeing in Ohio.
Okay, thanks. Now, as Eric mentioned, Ohio has been a reliable bellwether throughout the decades. It has correctly predicted the results of the presidential elections really since 1964. Ever since then, it has had what you might call a winning streak. And what I wanted to do is really go into detail about why that's been. So really a good representation of the state of Ohio as a whole is that area around Cleveland. Now, Cleveland is an area that has, unlike many big cities around the country, been shrinking in population, pretty rapidly declining in the last few years. And this is because of what has essentially been an exodus of working class population. But this is an area which has, in its most urban areas, a very high African American population, particularly in that area around Cleveland, particularly east of the Cuyahoga River, which is very much a cultural barrier. Now, as you get more into the suburbs and exurbs of the city, you get other big cities such as Akron, and Canton and Lorain, which are very much examples of what makes Ohio overall a very suburban state. And yeah, these are the sorts of areas that have swung very heavily to Trump in recent years. Then what you get as you go down south is really a flip side. You've got the Columbus area, and while other areas of the state have been shrinking in population, the Columbus area really doesn't seem to care what the rest of the state thinks because that has been growing pretty rapidly, especially if you take areas like outer Franklin County and Delaware County up north, where you got many of those suburbs. It's very much a growing city. This is very similar to what you see in cities around the country. And then you get Cincinnati in the south, which is similar in a way. It's been steadily increasing in population, as Eric says, has been swinging to the left, while Ohio has, as a whole, been swinging to the right, which could prove useful for Democrats in the future as they hope to win the state, such as in 2020. And now that's a rundown of the demographic aspects. Now I want to talk about the political aspects of the state, and for that I want to bring up the maps of the 2012 and 2016 elections. So as you can see in 2012, there is a lot of blue around the state, particularly around Cleveland and around that Toledo area, especially around the lake. As you can see, around Lake Erie, most of the counties there are blue. This is because this has a high working class population, high union population as well, and that area has been reliably Democratic for decades. Another area I want to point to is this area in the northeastern corner of the state. And this is where you got these three blue counties in the eastern part. From south to north, you have Mahoning County, which is home to Youngstown. Trumbull County, which contains many of those northern suburbs of Youngstown, and then you got Ashtabula County. Overall, this is a very industrial region, and also one that has voted pretty heavily Democratic because of those industrial tendencies. If you were following the news around the time of the 2016 election, in the run-up to it, a lot of people were talking about Ashtabula County. You had a few articles written about it by political scientists, and they predicted that this would be a bellwether county, which surprised many people, because this is a county that Barack Obama won by double digits. No one before that point expected it to be competitive. But as you go into 2016, you'll see that Trump won that county, and he actually won it by a sizable amount. He won it by almost 20 points. This really blew people away. This was over a 30-point swing, which is not really the sort of swing that you see anywhere else in the country. Another area which has swung a lot is the areas sort of south of that. That's mostly coal country. You have swings of like 30 and up to 40 points in those sorts of areas. And this is a huge part of what made Ohio such a decisive victory for Donald Trump, despite those growing suburbs in and around Columbus and Cincinnati, which did swing Democratic. But yeah, as you can see, it's not just the Mahoning Valley and generally that eastern part of the state. It's also all around. Like, as you can see around the lake, only Lucas County, which is where Toledo is, which is a very urban area. That was the only county in that area that went for Hillary Clinton. All of those other ones, they all went for Donald Trump. I can really go on about this all day, like looking at the granular details, but as you can see, like many of these suburban / ex-urban areas around the state have considerably declined in terms of Democratic support. And if Democrats want to win the state in the future, they're going to have to at least partially bring back support in these areas. They might not be able to restore them to levels of support that Barack Obama got, but swings in these sorts of areas will prove useful as Democrats go into 2020.
So now that Nick and Eric have both introduced the nuances and the regional differences of Ohio politics quite well, I'm going to go into how that is manifested in the gubernatorial and senatorial races that we've seen in recent history. You can see my screen here. First, I'm going to go into the gubernatorial races starting in 1990 with George Voinovich, and he happened to also be a senator preceding Rob Portman. His term ended in 2011, and so Rob Portman, a Republican, succeeded him. So Voinovich, he did quite well throughout the state. And one thing that you'll notice, as Eric briefly mentioned earlier, is that Republicans have had a lot of success, especially on the statewide gubernatorial level. And they've been able to cobble together some coalitions that would be virtually unrecognizable today. And you can see this, especially in this map. Cincinnati and Hamilton County, which used to be reliably Republican, but isn't anymore, its roots hold true in this map. You can see that it voted with margins that are not too far off from some of the surrounding counties like Butler, very Republican area. You also see that Franklin County with Columbus is also right here. And that is quite striking because Columbus today is a heavily Democratic area. It has a Democratic representative, and it is also one of the few places in Ohio whose suburbs are trending heavily Democratic. And so you see that Republican strength holds up quite well here. Also Delaware County, which is due north of Franklin County, a heavily suburban county with many educated individuals, college-educated individuals, also held up quite nicely for Voinovich. And then going over to Cleveland with Cuyahoga County, this is among the most Democratic areas in the state traditionally. But you can see that Cleveland, as well as Akron and Canton, which are directly below, they all did very well for the Republican in this race. And so that's quite interesting. The few pockets of Democratic support were in Toledo, which remains a stronghold of Democratic support to this day. Also in the Trumbull and Mahoning area with Youngstown, just a traditional sense of a working class Democratic populism that really pervaded the region, and it held through in many statewide races. And then also this Appalachian territory, if you will, that stretches along the border of West Virginia and Pennsylvania. And this is traditionally one of the most Democratic, or at least ancestrally Democratic areas of the state. And then finally, one other thing is Athens, which is home to Ohio University. It's a college town in a county, and so it is voted blue consistently in most, if not all, past races on this level. Going down to 94, you can see that within the Republican wave that swept over the nation that year, things things were quite rosy for Republicans in the state. And you can see that there are only 2 counties that voted Democratic. The rest of them gave huge margins to Voinovich, and he did quite well there. Bob Taft was the successor, and even though 1998 was frankly a mediocre year for Republicans, even though it was a Clinton midterm, Republicans did have some lack of success in various races around the country. You can still see that Bob Taft did quite well in the state. He won traditionally urban areas and suburban areas like Cincinnati, Columbus. He bled a little bit in the Cleveland area, but that clearly was not enough to cement a Democratic victory. And then, especially in the Appalachian area that I was talking about earlier, you did see some stronger Democratic margins. And this is, again, very reminiscent of a traditional difference. And one thing that you'll notice, especially going into some Senate races, I'll talk about a little bit later, is the West-East divide, where Republicans did very well in both urban and rural areas in the West, whereas the East was far more optimal for Democrats. You can see re-election was quite handedly won by Bob Taft. Those areas I talked about that were traditionally Democratic, they also voted Democrat here. And then some of them, such as straddling the West Virginia border, voted narrowly Republican, whereas the rest of the state delivered very comfortable margins for Bob Taft. 2006 was the only election in recent gubernatorial history that was won by a Democrat. You can see a familiar name here in Ken Blackwell, and he got demolished by Ted Strickland. Ted Strickland was a congressman who represented a lot of this Appalachian territory that I mentioned before. And you can really see that his roots delivered very, very sizable margins for him in this region. And so among his most favorable counties were in this region that he represented in Congress, whereas Ken Blackwell, surprisingly, he was able to win Cincinnati. And even though he lost the state by over 20 points, nearing 25 points, he was able to win Hamilton County, which is quite remarkable, really telling of some of the truisms of Ohio politics that used to exist.
It's worth noting that the outgoing governor at the time, Bob Taft, was literally one of the most unpopular politicians in American history. By the time he left office, he had corruption scandals. Within one poll, he had an approval rating of around 6%. So there was a lot that went into that race that was really unusual. But even then, you can see those divides that Jared's talking about.
Yeah, and so 2006 was a very rosy year for Democrats. Democrats did very well across the board in Ohio, and this was no exception. 2010, John Kasich is now considered more of a moderate Republican, but policy-wise, he was fairly conservative when he governed, and he was able to flip the seat back for Republicans. Ted Strickland was able to win, again, his home turf of the Appalachian region, as well as Mahoning, Trumbull, and Ashtabula County up north here. And so ancestral Democratic strength, white working class voters still polled quite nicely for him. However, John Kasich was able to capitalize upon this tide of Republican support that swept over the nation in 2010 and just demolish his opponent in urban areas like Cincinnati, as well as some of the suburbs of Cleveland and Columbus. And just throughout the state, he did very well, and he managed to narrowly flip the seat back for Republicans. 2014 was not even close. It was a disaster for Democrats. It was a disaster for Ed Fitzgerald, who ran on the Democratic ticket. And you can see that he only managed to win one of these counties in the Appalachian Territory, and then Athens, which is, again, a college town. Look at this county when we look at the next gubernatorial election, because you'll notice something very strange about it. What do you see here? This county actually flipped Republican. It is one of those lingering areas of ancestral Democratic support that still did not deliver Republicans a victory until 2018, as far as the gubernatorial races. And in 2018, you had a barn burner of a race. Polling actually showed Richard Cordray, who was part of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, I believe, previously. A lot of polling showed him to narrowly lead Mike DeWine. And Mike DeWine had a slew of positions in Ohio politics. His resume was among the most full of experience among any politician in Ohio up to that time. He was a senator. He was in the state legislature. He was an attorney general also. And so he had plenty of things to back himself up on. But you can see that nowadays Cincinnati is out of reach for Republicans. And Richard Cordray did very well in some of these urban areas, was able to cut down or at least pare down margins for Republicans in some of the suburbs like Delaware County. But the rurals did deliver pretty strongly for Mike DeWine. And he was able to win. One thing I want to mention before I move on to the Senate race is that looking on to 2022, Mike DeWine and John Husted, the lieutenant governor, are actually fairly unpopular among several constituencies of I guess you could say more of the right wing of Ohio, in that they were pretty strong and swift in their reaction to the COVID pandemic, instituting policies that would have also been used in more blue states under blue governors. And so they were pretty proactive in that. And that really has alienated some members of more of the right wing of the Ohio Republican Party. And there's actually an event quite recently that Mike DeWine and John Husted showed up. It was a Trump event, and they were actually booed by a lot of the audience because, again, they were deemed to be too proactive and just too confrontational of this virus. And so looking at 2022 rather, Mike DeWine might actually get primaried by somebody on the fringes of the right. And it is possible that is a pretty close primary that Mike DeWine is only able to eke out a victory in. So that's the governor. That gives a pretty broad overview of there. The Senate is another story because, at least on the federal level, things are often different than on the state level. You can recognize Mike DeWine here also. I mentioned his vast resume of positions in Ohio. This is no different. Again, he was a senator from Ohio actually before he became governor and before he served in a row office. And he won in 2000 quite handedly. He won almost all urban, suburban areas, and again, with those few notable exceptions in the Appalachian area, as well as Youngstown and Mahoning County and Trumbull County. In 2004, you had the other class, the other seat in Ohio, or in the Ohio senatorial delegation. And you can also recognize George Voinovich, who was governor beforehand. He also was able to secure this seat very handedly. He won every single county in 2004. But when you see these maps of a candidate winning every single county, it's very important, and you have to have a discerning eye and look at the actual county margins, because they tell usually a bigger story than what you see at face value. And so you can see that his margins were worse, especially in this traditional Democrat working class region of Ohio. 2006, going back to Mike DeWine, he lost this race, in fact, to Sherrod Brown. As I mentioned previously, this is not a good year for Republicans in Ohio. But the West-East divide, I think, is more evident here than in almost any other election in Ohio's recent history. You can see that Mike DeWine did win Cincinnati and won a lot of these counties in Western Ohio. But Sherrod Brown swamped a victory, especially by running up the score in some of these urban areas, but also just by doing well in this ancestral Democratic turf, in this industrial area, if you will, of Ohio. 2010, Rob Portman succeeded George Voinovich in that Senate seat, and Rob Portman won very handily, as well as, if you will, he helped bring John Kasich over the finish line in his gubernatorial race, but he won almost all areas of the state with some exceptions, as I talked about earlier. 2012, Josh Mandel ran against Sherrod Brown. This was expected by some to be a fairly close race. Josh Mandel, a decent candidate, and actually in 2018, he was considering a run, but there were some personal or familial issues that prevented him from doing so in the long run. But Sherrod Brown, he ended up winning the state more comfortably than Obama, but it really was because he does have that lingering strength in some of the more Democratic, or at least traditionally Democratic areas of the state, while also doing very well in more of the urban spots. You can see here, for example, that Dayton, Ohio in Montgomery County, this is a county that Trump was able to win, and DeWine won in 2018, but he did quite well in counties like these. 2016, this was supposed to be a close race by some measures, it turned out to not be this way at all. Rob Portman won by over 20%. And this was very impressive because even though Trump won the state by over 8%, this was even more so of a victory for Republicans. And he absolutely demolished Ted Strickland, especially in those suburbs, those well-educated suburbs of Cincinnati and Columbus. He also did well in Akron and Canton and Youngstown. He actually won Tim Ryan's congressional seat, which is made as a Democratic gerrymander, to take in some of these areas like Youngstown, going to Akron and Canton. But Ted Strickland actually did outrun Hillary Clinton in one area of the state, and that was namely his home turf of this Appalachian region of Ohio. Finally, 2018, the most recent senatorial race, Sherrod Brown ran against Jim Renacci, and Jim Renacci didn't really have a robust campaign. He didn't really do much, and especially for a state as competitive as Ohio. Even in 2018, it could have been a very close race. And in fact, it still turned out to be a pretty underwhelming margin for Sherrod Brown. Sherrod Brown is, just to give you a little bit of information, he's more of a progressive. He could be deemed as more idiosyncratic. He doesn't really fit in with some of the tendencies of Ohio, but Jim Renacci's campaign was so poor that, albeit narrowly, he lost this race to Sherrod Brown.
He seemed to have had that one poll, the missing internal poll that someone mentioned, where he was at 56% and just decided, well, I'm just not going to campaign anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
I just want to mention before we move on, like you kept pointing out that one county in Eastern Ohio. That's actually Monroe County. This is like the heart of Obama-Trump land. Obama won it in 2008. Romney won it by about 8 points, and then Trump won it by about 48. It swung a massive amount. Like, it's hard to see those swings anywhere else in the country.
Wow. And that really tells the whole story about that region. I mean, that's really just an impressive decline from an area that just a few decades ago was pretty resoundingly Democratic.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
For sure. Great overview right there. So we're going to go actually right into one of the most important parts of Ohio, which is congressional districts. Ohio has a very gerrymandered congressional map, and it's immediately apparent if you even take a look at the thing. I mean, it's honestly a feat of magic that this map has not backfired, because it makes a lot of risks that are frankly unusual and don't make a whole lot of sense right now. Just to give you a bit of insight, the previous congressional districts were also gerrymandered, but to some degree they looked all right. For example, Cincinnati was split in two here, but the district was more competitive. It had 18 districts instead of the current. Like, basically, it was a lot better, a little bit more compact than this time. But you know, some weird things like Columbus was split into two Republican vote sinks. That would not actually have held now. Both 12 and 15 in this case would probably be Democratic districts now, I would think, just based on the trends there. But Democrats did really well in places like 6 and 18. So Republicans redrew the map in 2012, and they created a pretty egregious and very effective gerrymander that's held 100% through these elections. Some of these districts were dangerously narrow when they were drawn. Places like the 14th, the 16th, even the 10th, the 12th. These places were a lot more competitive on paper before Trump. And so I'm going to kind of give you an overview of each of these districts, just real quick, to give you an idea of what we're looking at. The first district is represented by Steve Chabot. He represents part of Cincinnati. He lost his district in 2008, but regained it in 2010 and got a safer district this time. It's Republican +5, and it's the only district that's competitive this cycle. We have it as leans Republican at Elections Daily. If there's a district in the state that would flip from Trump, this would be the district to look at. The second is the other portion of Cincinnati. It goes through some of those communities adjacent to the states of Kentucky, and overall just traditionally competitive areas, but the seat isn't competitive anymore. The third is a new Democratic vote sink that is represented by Joyce Beatty. And the district is actually it's what Stephen Wolf would probably call a majority or a minority competition district, although he would not consider this to be a fair district. Around a third of the population is black. And so this has enabled Joyce Beatty to win the Democratic primary and have the representation of the district, even though it's not majority minority. Jim Jordan is a very Republican district right here. You can obviously see it just stretches all of the most Republican areas of Western Ohio into just a single vote sink. Bob Latta is in the 5th, which is in Bowling. He represents Bowling Green. This is another very Republican district, and it was Republican even before Trump. Bill Johnson's district represents a lot of, if you look at it right here, it represents basically what the core of Ted Strickland's sort of seat would be like. Stretches from the Charleston, West Virginia suburbs all the way up to Pittsburgh, Youngstown. Historically, it would be competitive. Now it's not competitive at all, and it's the most Republican district in the state, at least according if you go by who Trump's won. The 7th is represented by Bob Gibbs, and you notice here it draws in some of those Great Lakes areas, draws in areas around Columbus, around Akron, and parts of Canton as well. Going down to the 8th is represented by Warren Davidson. This was a very Republican district. This is what was John Boehner represented this district. So it went from a hardcore sort of establishment guy to just a Freedom Caucus, super libertarian sort of guy. It's absurdly Republican. People have talked about this district being competitive if it were drawn fairly, and there is no scenario under the sun in which this district will be competitive. Even in a 20-point Democratic landslide, these are the most solid Republican areas of the state. Marcy Kaptur's Toledo seat really bothers a lot of Democrats, and you can see why. It's contiguous by a bridge, and also by a tiny little strip of land. This is the most Democratic working class areas around the Great Lakes, and Democrats hate it. And I get why. It's a horrendous seat. Mike Turner's Dayton seat is actually a little more competitive than the Cincinnati one, but Mike Turner is a really, really popular incumbent. It's a trending area. He's notably bucked his party on some issues like an assault weapons ban, so he's pretty in touch with where his district's more urban sensibilities lie. Marcia Fudge's district is just basically the majority-minority district. It draws in parts of Akron, parts of Canton, and most of Cleveland. It's absurdly Democratic. I don't even think that someone like John Kasich won the seat in his run. It's just that Democratic. Troy Balderson's district, you might have remembered this one. There was a special election here a while back, and it was very competitive. This has most of Delaware County, or all of Delaware County, in fact, and the reason in Columbus, or the reason that he only narrowly won the seat the first time, but he's pretty safe in it now. Tim Ryan's seat is that working class, white working class vote sink that actually started to vote towards Republicans. It wouldn't be impossible in a few cycles that the seat would become reliably Republican. As it is, Tim Ryan is a pretty populist Democrat, although he shifted support, and he wanted to run for president. He shifted his support on abortion. For example, he was previously pro-life, now he's pro-choice, but that didn't really pan out for him. And honestly, this is one of the seats that's on the chopping block if and when Ohio loses a congressional district. David Joyce's seat is that northeastern corner seat that I was talking about that is on paper is fairly competitive, but a strong incumbent like him has been able to hold it, even though it has portions of Cuyahoga County and places like that. Steve Stiver's district, again, has Athens and has a lot of these areas around Columbus. Could be competitive at some point in the past, but it isn't right now. Probably the most interesting of these incumbents is the 16th Anthony Gonzalez. So if you're familiar with the name, he was actually an NFL wide receiver for a couple of years. He was drafted in 2007, spent a couple of years as Peyton Manning's number 3 target behind Reggie Wayne, behind Marvin Harrison at the wide receiver slot. But ultimately, his career is fairly uneventful, like a lot of representatives that go to Congress, except for example, the great Steve Largent, who was very successful as an NFL player. Most NFL players that go to Congress aren't like that. And Anthony Gonzalez ran as a Trumpy candidate, but has actually been fairly moderate. And in fact, he is a Latino representative. In fact, he's the first Hispanic representative from Ohio, and he seems pretty well set to be a moderate here. And the reason why is this seat is horrendous and will be redrawn and redistricting for sure. And so he wants to have a moderate credibility to be able to run next cycle. And there's a reason for that, which is that Ohio recently changed their redistricting laws. It was a bipartisan reform. I've written about this before. I think it's actually a model for states to follow going forward. I'll throw it to Nick to kind of explain the practical implications, but the broad gist of the bill is that both sides of the legislature will have to agree on maps. So basically, it'll be drawn by the legislature, and you need, I believe, you need support from half of both parties for it to be passed. If you don't get support from half of both parties, plus 2/3 of the legislature, so basically a supermajority plus a majority of the minority party, it won't be approved. It goes to a council, which is comprised of some elected officials and the governor, If that isn't approved by them along with minority support, then it can be redrawn at the desires of the legislature, but only for a couple of cycles. It's basically designed, and on top of that, it has objective standards as to how many counties can be split, what cities can and can't be split, population thresholds. It's a very comprehensive bill, and it'll be interesting to see how it goes into effect next cycle as compared to the more popular idea of an independent commission. But I'm going to go ahead and throw it to Nick, who's going to explain some of these, some of the implications of this new process.
Okay, great, thanks. So Eric really hit the nail on the head. He pretty much covered everything that that ballot measure in 2018 did. It requires compromise for the first few stages, but it does have like a little loophole at the end where if they can't find compromise, they can pass a bill in the legislature which pretty much lets them pass whatever map they want. But this would only be in place for 4 years, so they would have to redraw it in another 4 years. Like this would be pretty interesting to see what actually happens because some people have criticized it. Some people have said that it's not a proper fair redistricting plan because it doesn't guarantee that the fair map is in place. And another thing that this measure does is actually create a standard for how the districts are drawn. I believe they have to be compact and contiguous. It essentially limits county splitting very, very much. Like it says that 18 counties can only be split once, and the state's 5 most populous counties can be split twice. Now this is a big deal because in the current map there is actually an insane amount of county splits. I counted it today. I believe it's 31 county splits in the current map. I don't even think that I counted that correctly just because there's so many. It's so hard to keep track. But I actually want to take you into a fair map that I did. This was created on Dave's redistricting. I did it back in the summer, and I'm actually quite happy with how this went out. This is actually probably one of my most successful maps on Dave's redistricting. Keeps county splits to a minimum, keeps the districts fairly compact, and also it keeps those communities of interest together. Now, I want to show on a quick overview of the state. First of all, very recognizable change is that Cincinnati and Hamilton County around it gets its own district. Now, it actually can't fit like completely into its own district, but it does get very close, and that does actually become a Democratic district. It was won by Hillary Clinton by 12 points. Would have been competitive in the past, probably not anymore. Then going north, you've got the 10th district, and something that I find shocking about the 10th district at the moment is how surprisingly not gerrymandered it is. It contains all of Dayton, and it pretty much extends to those suburbs. And I mean, Mike Turner has survived regardless of that, mainly because of his candidate strength. But this version of the map, because the state is losing a district and this area in general is losing population, I actually managed to fit the city of Springfield into this district, which actually makes it a little bit more blue. So if Mike Turner were to retire, then this district could be very competitive. If not, well, it's anyone's guess. Like no one really knows for sure how much this candidate strength lasts. And going up north, Eric did mention Jim Jordan's district, and this is something that I've had numerous rants about on Twitter because people say that Jim Jordan got the seat because of gerrymandering, which isn't true. His current district actually takes in a lot of those Western Ohio areas, and then it stretches into Lorain County, which actually makes the district more blue. This is an aspect of gerrymandering called cracking, and it's intended to make districts that aren't too favourable for one party, but just favourable enough so that they're safe there. And that's essentially what they did with Jim Jordan's district. This one is far more Republican. It was actually won by Trump by over 50 points. It's the most Republican area of the state by far. And then going further ahead, like to Columbus. Columbus gets its own Democratic district, and it also gets its own swingy district. Now, this 12th district here is actually the rare case of a Romney-Clinton district in Ohio. It's very difficult to draw a district like this, but this is definitely the sort of area that you get it. Hillary Clinton won this district by 3 points after Mitt Romney won it. It was competitive twice in 2018, once in a special election and once in the November election. And the current version of the 12th district is a lot more red than this one is. So you could see Democrats flipping this. And then we go into the Cleveland region. Now this is interesting because you got that 11th district. What this 11th district is essentially the whole of Cleveland, and all of the Cleveland suburbs that are east of the Cuyahoga River. We discussed these earlier. This is very centralized culturally. The district is majority minority. This would be represented by Marcia Fudge. So not much will change here. This is a very safe Democratic district. But those two districts next to it, the 9th and the 7th, these would be interesting to look at, because the 7th is essentially a whole new seat. It's created out of like an insane amount of splitting in this area. I believe Summit County, which is the county that includes Akron, I believe that's split about 5 times in the current map. And it's kept whole in this map. This is actually a slightly Democratic-leaning district. Hillary Clinton wins this one by 0.9 points, but this would have swung massively in recent years. And the 9th, really it's a similar case. Hillary Clinton won it by a narrow margin. This would actually be the district which Anthony Gonzalez would live in. As Eric mentioned, Anthony Gonzalez has taken sort of a bipartisan stance, and he's generally considered to be a strong candidate. So even though this district here is Democratic leaning, he would have a very good chance of winning here. So if you look at how his district might be drawn, or really any other way it could be drawn around here, it really makes sense that he would try to look ahead like that. And then there's the 5th district. This is represented by Marcy Kaptur. She has a very frequent tendency to overperform the rest of the ticket. So although it was also won by Clinton narrowly, this would probably be safe Democrat, unless Bob Latta, who also lives in the district, he actually represents the 5th, which is the other district that splits that Eastern Ohio area. He lives in a safe Republican district now, but he would essentially be moved into a safe Democratic district. So there's not really much way to see how he could survive, unless he wants to move and then primary Jim Jordan, which might fulfill the dreams of all of Twitter activists who hate Jordan's guts. But really anything could happen in this sort of area. And then the last area I want to discuss is that Eastern Ohio area. We've gone into it in depth. This 6th actually consolidates most of that like coal country area. A high number of Obama-Trump voters, contains some of those areas that we talked about, like Monroe County or like Belmont County. But the really interesting one is the 13th. Now, the 13th currently is drawn as Democratic voting, but it has swung hugely in recent years. So if Republicans essentially chop it up, they're free to. But what this map does is it really chops it up anyway. I think it works because it does contain a lot of those areas that you talked about earlier. It keeps the whole of the Mahoning Valley together. Include Ashtabula, which is quite similar, like demographically to the Mahoning Valley. And the reason I find this district so interesting is because it is about as extreme of an Obama-Trump district as you can get. Obama won it by about 15 points, and then Trump won it by about 15 points as well. This would be really interesting to look at, because you got an incumbent in Tim Ryan. He's generally considered a strong incumbent. He's very popular in the district. But it would be very interesting to see whether he would survive in what has become essentially heavily Republican from what was once heavily Democratic.
So that's a great map from Nick, and I think it's a good perspective as to the possibilities of this map, because ultimately you have to follow those strict Ohio redistricting standards. I applied the same standard to my map, which I made as well, that I'm going to show, which takes a little bit of a different approach to some areas, but I think it's a fair map overall as well. So you'll notice a lot of similarities with our maps. The 1st and the 2nd are basically identical. I think especially a lot of the Dayton district is very similar. I prioritized in mine keeping metropolitan areas intact. So I prioritized that over. I didn't look at partisan affiliation or anything when drawing this. If you want to look at the partisan lean, that's pretty clear. But a lot of what I did is pretty simple. So for example, the 8th is the most Republican district in the state by far. I mean, this is just an absurdly Republican district by any standard. I think it would have probably gone for Trump by, that 50-point margin. Places like the 9th, I think, is identical to what Nick had. And we did not draw these maps collaboratively. We draw them differently, but I think we came to the same conclusion there. But there are a few differences. So the 12th in my map is a little bit more Republican than I think in his. I don't have the exact vote totals, but you'll notice right here in 2008, it was a Republican plus 7 seat. Composite 2012 to 16 is a Republican plus 5. So still a very competitive district, and it has most of the county right here, which is the significant county for ticket splitting. Also, the 6th, which kind of anchors the rest of the Columbus metropolitan area. The 15th here, it does kind of split coal country in two, but I think it distinguishes between the Charleston area, suburbs, and Athens, and these Kentucky areas that border Kentucky, with the areas that border West Virginia that are more adjacent to Wheeling or to Erie, places like that. The 4th district is also Republican, but it's a little bit different. It was only Obama or McCain plus 11, but in this one, it's definitely much more so for Trump. The 7th district is a very narrow district. I think this would have been an Obama-Trump district, but it would be very competitive. And if you notice here, the lines that it follows, the cities are kept entirely intact for the most part. The cities aren't loading there, but you'll just have to take my word on it for that one. The 13th district is still a Democratic district. It's Democrat plus 5, and it would have been composite as well. It draws in parts of Akron, parts of Youngstown. I figured that the Democratic-leaning areas of here, keeping those together are more important than keeping the Mahoning Valley together. And also the 14th is it's a different region. It's still a competitive district, but it's a little bit more drawing in that portion of Cuyahoga. I figured a north-south split here was a little bit more important than an east-west split. Finally, the 5th is a really interesting one because that one notice right here, this is actually an Obama district. This would have gone for Obama by 1.6 percentage points, but Trump would have easily won this district. And the reason why is it does have a lot of these areas that are more traditionally Democratic. And so I'll show you the partisan lean on a presidential level. So you notice right here, Democrats would have won a majority of districts. I'll turn off county lines so you can see a little bit clearer. Republicans would have had advantages in 5 districts and an additional 2. And the Democrats would have had advantages in the rest. So they would have won the majority of the congressional districts in the state overall. But it would have been fairly close, and a lot of these would have been competitive to some degree. A composite map as well shows similarly. Republicans would have had an advantage because the center of the state is just so Republican at this point. But a lot of these are marginal seats, like 7, 14, even places like 12 and 10 would be competitive. And then finally, 2016, which is a landslide for president, is just the Trump totals and the rurals are just overwhelmingly Republican. I mean, these districts would have gone resoundingly Republican. I mean, there's a couple of ones over here. Obviously, the 12th is competitive. But as a whole, it's just this rural strength and the kind of gains in the Great Lakes region that have made this state a little bit less competitive than expected. Obviously, Republicans could draw a gerrymander still. There are ways to do it. There's even ways to do a stealth gerrymander. For example, you could technically take all of Cincinnati and split Hamilton County once. You could chop up Cuyahoga at least 3 times, but the likelihood of them doing that is, I think, pretty narrow, especially considering there are those safeguards in place. Yeah, so with that, we're going to wrap up this week's episode of The Map Room. We hope this was an informative experience for you. And if you like the show, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We appreciate your support. And be sure to click the bell icon so you get notified whenever we publish new episodes, which is usually every week. But yeah, where can we find you guys on social media, Jared and Nick?
You can find me on Twitter at JSnowPolitics.
You can find me on Twitter. My handle is TossUpReport.
And you can find me on Twitter at DECunningham2. You can find us on Twitter at elections_daily and elections-daily.com. We do election analysis. We have maps. We do cover some polling. And we also have a lot of podcasts we put out every week as well. So be sure to give us a look there. But thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you on next week's edition of The Map Room.